Regulation of any sort is really useless without an enforcement program. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has a really strong enforcement program. EPA Region 2 covers New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it's also committed to a strong federal enforcement presence. From year to year, the number of enforcement actions that we start may vary a lot. But this trend over time shows big increases in federal enforcement activity. EPA and Region 2 are more careful and refined in selecting enforcement targets. This is the enforcement thinking that EPA has developed over 40 years of environmental enforcement and how that thinking has been implemented in Region 2. There are several unquestionable observations that explain the agency's enforcement thinking. First is, compliance with environmental rules is often really expensive, sometimes extremely expensive, and the investments required generally don't enhance the profits of affected industry. Businesses aren't going to voluntarily elect to comply with such rules without powerful incentives. Even including that, we've got broad voluntary compliance by business is important if the environmental programs are to be really effective. This is because the number of pollution sources subject to regulation are larger than the government's capability for oversight. Simply, EPA can't afford to have an environmental cop on every corner, so EPA has to rely on business to police itself. The government's enforcement strategy has to be designed to create a climate where the natural profit-driven incentives are driving business to not comply with costly rules gets overcome by other incentives. Such a climate is helpful to wide voluntary compliance is fostered. It depends on whether the regulated community is really aware of the rules that apply to it. Industry has to believe there's a significant chance that violations are going to be found. Companies have to believe that if a violation is found, it's likely that really important and strong sanctions, usually like monetary penalties of an appropriate size, are going to be imposed. At the same time, an enforcement strategy has to be designed to respond to the biggest violations, based on how severe their environmental impact is, or the impact that these violations have on the integrity of the regulatory scheme. EPA has concluded that in order to have the best chance of achieving these ambitious goals, an effective enforcement strategy has to deal with some 5 different parts of the enforcement process. The first is identifying affected facilities, educating the facility operators and providing compliance assistance, monitoring their compliance, selecting and carrying out a timely and appropriate enforcement response when violations are found, and then following up to ensure future compliance by former violators. EPA's enforcement strategy also has to encourage regulated communities to do the self-policing that EPA sees as important for the overall success of the program.